We're going to do this ASMR style.
You can get like really good quality on these.
Nice.
Yeah. So like I mentioned earlier in another conversation a few days ago, and I'm paraphrasing here, but you said something like psychedelics dissolve you so that you can put yourself back together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like that's kind of the most apt metaphor, is that psychedelics, they sort of liquefy you. And then over time, over the course of the trip, then you recrystallize and re-solidify. And if you do it in the proper set and setting, and you do it in a clean, comfortable, safe space, then you have the opportunity to recrystallize in a purer state, or in a more integrated state than before. So that, I think that's part of the healing properties of psychedelic experiences.
Have you ever recrystallized in a way that surprised you after it happened?
Yeah, I mean, of course, every time really this is surprising in some way, but unless you mean in a not so nice way, which can also happen if you do it in not the appropriate set and setting. If you do it at a party or something, and with drunk people around, or you combining it with alcohol, or other stuff, then that's where you can have a bad trip, or you just come back and something feels off, maybe, that can happen. But if you stick to the basics and you set up your environment ahead of time, and then it's almost guaranteed that you're going to have a positive experience.
Do you think you'd still be an artist if you hadn't taken psychedelics?
My roots in art, of course, go back into my childhood, where I wasn't, taking any exogenous psychedelics, but maybe endogenous tripping like all kids do. But I don't know. It's tough to say. I think part of also what the psychedelic experience gives you is that it can give you courage. And I think courage is something that's necessary in order to pursue an art track. I've had one experience. This was like when I was in college and tripping on mushrooms in the desert outside of Tucson. And I had one experience where it really felt like a song was like bubbling up out of my throat. But I didn't have the wherewithal or the courage to, let it go and let it out. I also have zero, singing experience or anything like that. So maybe that's something that's kind of necessary to let those things come out. But it was a really interesting experience, and immediately I understood like what I had learned growing up in an indigenous context, that sometimes sacred songs are just kind of delivered to people through people. And there's also one interesting thing when I did dieta, which is ayahuasca in Peru in 2019. There was also a ceremony where I felt like something was opening up my throat, and it opened it up in a very unique way that actually changed the texture of my palate on the roof of my mouth, and it changed the taste of the palate as well, and it made it like sweeter, and it changed like my voice for a while. It was really interesting.
How long did that last?
I think I had it maybe for another month or two, and by then it had kind of faded to either the point where it became the new normal, or it went away, or it was somewhere in between. I mean, I think that there's definitely some sort of permanent change, that happened and that happens in these experiences, but yeah, that specific sort of unique flavor and feeling, which is so weird, it's like physiological. And yeah, that lasted for a few weeks after. I had this one acid trip recently where I made the mistake where I kind of lost track of my phone and I didn't get my music sorted before then. And then I actually slipped into a bit of a bad trip in that time because there was kind of this, because first of all, tripping in the city is very difficult and you have to really, control your inputs. And one way of doing that is, having your music and having your playlist sorted out. But if you're not listening to music, then kind of all the other sounds of the city or the lack of sounds in the city, they can then kind of color your experience, and that can sometimes go into bad trip direction.
Was this the time you told me that your house was haunted or your apartment was haunted?
Yes. This is when I thought that there was some sort of, not evil, but some sort of dark spirit that was living there, either in the neighborhood or in that apartment. My mom wrote a paper, an essay about how alcohol is a spirit. And we literally call it a spirit, But it's a spirit that Europeans made a covenant with. And so it's a spirit that helps them colonize, has historically helped them colonize other people and enslave other people. And maybe the only sacrifice is that one person out of every generation is given to the spirit in the form of alcoholism, I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah, it kind of is the most intense of all the drugs I've ever tried by a long shot.
Yeah, of course. And it has such a hold on society that it's almost invisible. It's so deep. Yeah, I don't know. Did you want to get into the post-internet network culture stuff?
Sure, yeah. If something comes to mind with that.
Maybe what I would say is that when it comes to like post-internet genre, there's a bit of a kind of a silent schism, or there's a bit of I felt like from early on there was sort of two dominant strains of it. And this is something that is true in the artwork, but is less reflected in the criticism or the writing. And I think writers are almost a bit blind to it so far. Maybe this will be dug up at some point. But basically, when the scene first started in Berlin, I moved here like in 2008. And maybe 2008 to 2014 is sort of maybe the classical period of that. And there's a lot of this post-internet art happening, and a lot of it had to do with network culture, like you said, and like the effects of technology on culture and humans. But for myself and for some others, I think like that was less interesting. Like for me, it was never really, I was never really interested in the effects of technology, on the effects of the internet on culture. I think that was all, interesting enough, but it was just something that we're living through. And I mean, I think it only went so deep. So anyway, so there was, a lot of people that were kind of dealing with the effects of network technologies on culture. But then there was also this kind of nascent strain of what I would call like artists and art that was kind of more interested in like the evolution of culture, cultural evolution, and in a more general way, and also like in a more morphological way, like how design objects were evolved and how that ultimately kind of linked back into the biological, and not necessarily even like biological in the sense that it's related to the body necessarily, but more in the sense that there are these sort of more universalized dynamics at play that go into the creation of form, and whether that's a body or whether that's culture. And so for myself, like I was very much interested in the circulation of images, kind of in this similar to this like Seth Price way, or at least that was like a touchstone that kind of set a lot of this stuff off, and also Oliver Lyric's versions. But I think what I was interested in is how to connect that into a more universalized conception of how culture is formed in general. And so for me, I was very much interested in dynamical systems and attractors within spaces and critical thresholds and metaphors like that. So on the one hand, there was this post-internet art that was like about the internet and everything internet. And then maybe artists like Katya Novitskova and others, and myself included, we started being more biologically minded and thinking more about animals, for example, as Katya did. And, the motivation for me was, this was a way, ultimately it had to do with nature, It's like, how do you address nature? And back then, but what's interesting is back then there was really kind of like a allergic reaction to the topic of nature. I think like back then people really thought that like thinking about nature, that nature was like inherently essentialist. Like that's how they equated the natural. Like anything that was claiming to be natural was like claiming an essentialism. Which of course is not true. Nature is the ultimate non-essential system, or dynamic. There's no, it's pure evolution, right? It's pure change. And I always felt that this was more of a reflection of kind of the dominant Western understanding, outdated understanding of what nature is. And so back then, there was this allergic reaction against nature and the biological, and, climate change was really not on anybody's mind in the art world back then.
This time period being what specifically would you say?
2010 through 2015, 2016. Really just up until COVID, I think it was COVID that really like brought nature back in a big way. And before then, people really thought of nature or the topic of nature from this point of view that if you're concerned about nature, then you're not concerned about the social. And they put that in opposition. And of course, that's totally not true, and especially from an indigenous point of view, like that polarization and that dichotomy is not true. And in fact, it should be the other way around. If you actually care about people, then you care about nature as well. But that was a different time when I think there wasn't enough general updated science knowledge, especially in the art world. I think maybe it's from too many people going to just pure art schools.
Yeah, that it could be interesting to hop in there, because I do feel like I finished art school in, I guess, 2019, so right before shit hit the fan with COVID, and it did feel so like self-contained, like it was just a isolated discourse about itself. And I would read like all these kind of classical art theory texts from the 60s, 70s, 80s. And it was like it had become so about itself that it almost wasn't like it was able to interface with the world anymore.
Mm-hmm. Very siloed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
incommensurable.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we're coming off of a century of really intense specialization.
Mm-hmm.
Like virtually every field was just kind of in the silo, like you said. And yeah, what role do you think art has in kind of spanning those silos that were built up over the previous couple generations, so that all of the knowledge that's like real, interesting, and often useful knowledge can like interface with knowledge in other disciplines? Do you feel like that's part of your role as an artist?
Yeah, I would say so. It's a valuable function that art can fulfill. Of course, so much art is itself siloed in its own kind of conversations. But I think there is a value if you can figure out how to span those conversations and bring things in from the outside. And yeah, it's a challenge, but I think it's worthwhile. It's interesting. I mean, even today, there's not really a lot of scholarship or criticism that addresses this at all, or doesn't even, it totally like flies under the radar. Even though it's such a big thing, you see so many young art students that are like making this kind of work, this kind of biological, cybernetic kind of stuff. And yeah, for a long time, there was no language really for it, because maybe, writers and curators in the art world, they weren't really into the same thing. And that wasn't really what interested them. And to this day, maybe still not so. I mean, now, climate change is getting more intense and becoming a bigger topic, and COVID, of course. But, still, it's like ecology is like now safe to talk about. But ecology is also the easiest thing to integrate about nature, like ecology is, yeah, of course, we need some ecological balance and systems that are working. But, another thing that's still not really, it's either taboo or it's just like so broad that it's just difficult to grasp or even know how to integrate into the conversation. And that's evolution, So ecology is easy, but evolution is more difficult. And even though evolution is really, that's the process, right? That's ultimately, you can say that's the only process. But yeah, I think it just comes down to this fundamental difference between a Western perspective on the world and a more universal non-Western perspective, which is that the Western perspective is that the universe is fundamentally dead. It's like a universe of dead furniture in a sense. And from indigenous perspectives globally, the universe is fundamentally alive. Everything is alive. And I think now science is getting to the point where, these kinds of questions are actually kind of relevant questions. What's alive and what's dead is not so clear cut anymore. And even beyond whether or not that's true, there's like an adaptive advantage to believing that things are alive, you know. Like, this is a point that Wade Davis makes, which is that, you know, in a Western context, we're raised to think of a mountain essentially as a pile of rocks. And from many non-Western and indigenous points of view, mountains are entities, they're deities, they're spirits. And so that makes a big difference in how we treat a mountain. You know, if we're brought up to think of a mountain as a pile of rocks, essentially, then there's nothing stopping us from just, you know, blowing it up and doing whatever we want with it.
Yeah. Blow a hole through the middle, stick a highway in
Exactly,
there.
exactly. But if we think of it as being alive, you know, something that we have to negotiate with, then that changes our behavior. And you know, I think this is a cultural difference. It's a very like concrete difference in culture. And what's interesting is that Western culture has oftentimes the inability to see itself as a specific historical culture. It universalizes itself. And so its own culture is essentially invisible to itself. And then today, basically the scapegoat that we all pile onto is like capitalism, right? The system of, we blame the system, the economic system. But that's just because people are generally unable to see that capitalism is really just an extension of a specific culture, a specific historical contingent culture. And yeah, so I think it's very interesting that we have this idea that it's capitalism that's destroying the world. But it's not. It's actually, it's a cultural attitude, you know. It has to do with how we value things spiritually. That's what it comes down to.
Like the spirit of the mountain, the mind of the mountain, the spirit of a forest system.
I don't think it needs a mind necessarily. I think a mind is maybe something else, not necessary for a spirit. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say the mountain has a mind. I think that for a mind, you maybe do need a brain or whatever. But that's not to say that there's not a living characteristic to it, a living quality. That's also processing data, you know?
Yeah, that's another thread that we should try to pull in. Computation, data processing, the universe as information processing itself. Would you describe the universe as a computer, or is that an overreach where we're taking our technology now and then saying, oh, maybe everything else is like this, like we always do when we have a new technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the other way around. I think maybe the computer is a little universe. You know what I mean?
I'm not sure. Can you unpack it?
Like, it's not that the universe is a computer, it's that the computer is a smaller fractal version of what the universe is. Just like everything in the universe is a fractal, smaller version of it. You know, just like us. We're just a little branch on this tree of reality. And so is a computer and a simulation as well. And there's fundamental differences in scale in the universe, in reality. So it makes sense that an information processing system at the scale of a computer is one thing, but then at another scale, it's something totally different.
So you would push against the old dictum, as above, so below, that these processes at different scales often mirror each other?
I mean, I think that there's a fractal self-similarity in the universe, of course. Yeah, there's a fractalness. Yeah. But I don't think it's, it's not 100%. And it's, yeah, I mean, there really are differences in the dynamics of the universe at different scales. Like, for example, we experience the viscosity of water very differently than like a little tardigrade or whatever, that like the viscosity is totally, water is much more viscous at a smaller scale than for us. And so, yeah, that's just like a very concrete physical example of how things just are different at different scales. And of course the same goes with time and actual space and stuff. So there is a self-similarity, but it doesn't have to be 100%.
Yeah, and then new difference opens up everywhere as you're...
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've noticed in a lot of reading, I got really curious about like early 20th century avant-gardes in science and the arts. And in the reading kind of this generation that included like Henri Poincaré, Duchamp, and who's another, the poet, Mallarmé. So kind of in these different fields, there was this fixation like around the turn of the century with like chance, like pure like random number generation as somehow being like the baseline of the universe, and then everything is built on top of that. And when I was reading through this book by Eduardo Kohn, it made me think back to that kind of suspicion they had with like the kind of foundational role of chance in the structure of the universe, where he was talking about form and how form develops, which was great. And for listeners, this was from a book called How Forests Think by an anthropologist named Eduardo Kohn that you recommended. But yeah, so in this chapter about form specifically, he describes how form is basically an emergent property that takes hold when a pattern that's more chaotic suddenly, because of certain constraints, becomes more structured. Like his example was like a whirlpool in a river. Like if there are rocks arranged in a certain way as the water flows, some of it will get caught and starts spinning around. And this emergent structure is really real. It can be incredibly dangerous. Say if you're riding your boat down the river and get stuck in one, you're having a bad day. But if the water were for some reason to stop flowing, like let's say there was a drought and the water dried up and the level wasn't as high, the whirlpool, this emergent structure, this emergent form would disappear. And yeah, I guess there's almost this feeling of these initially chaotic, this like just total like random number generator energy bouncing around can over time kind of start to consolidate into more and more repeatable patterns. And whether you could build up and universes we experience today is like these forms, these things that want to be more chaotic, more complex, get condensed into like a predictable flow, and then more form in turn emerges out of that. Yeah, I don't know if you got to Or yeah, you were going to say something.
Isn't it true that like we don't have a true random number generator, for example? I think that ultimately it's always based on some physical interaction of some kind. But also, just with the emergence of complexity theory and the emergence of computers and computation in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, they realized that all these systems that we thought of as random, for example, like a random dripping faucet, was actually like deeply fractal, and deeply structured. So what we thought of as random noise, if once they were able to actually plot these things, including things like the stock market or like noise on a telephone line or whatever, like all those things that we thought were random, if you like really analyze them in a deep way, then you start discovering fractal structures, which is like scalar self-similarity, like what we were just talking about, and other just patterns. That's what they find in all seemingly random systems in the universe and realities. So while it's innately non-computable, it's actually like most numbers or most problems in the world fall into the category of non-computability. But that doesn't mean that it's random, It's like, it's still like deeply structured. And that really is actually like one of the foundations to New Peace. I think like when I learned that, maybe when I was in college, it like really connected with my experience of being in nature. And in nature, you also have this experience where there's all this contingency around you, all this stuff that's just happening by accident. But then it emerges into just, sublime patterning. There's just this deep patterning that happens everywhere at all scales. And then somehow it also is beautiful as well, which I always thought was really weird. Like, why is it that nature tends to organize itself in such aesthetic ways? And I know that many people are going to be like, oh, or many people would think like, well, that's just like your bias in perceiving these things. But I actually don't think that that's true. I think there really is an inherent deep aesthetic quality to reality, to the universe. And I think it's also related to health. I think like beauty and health are intimately related. You can go into an environment and you can see if it's healthy or not, basically by how beautiful it is. You can go into a forest, and if it's looking disheveled, then chances are it's like it's not that healthy. And I know, I think that there's, I'm sure there's, some science to address some of this in some ways, but maybe it can only go so far.
To push back on that a little bit, what about the old saying that beauty is in the eye of the beholder? More specifically, it seems that maybe you can average out some things like, X number of people will on average say that this photo of a landscape is more aesthetically appealing than this photo of a landscape. But that appreciating the beauty in something can also come later. Like I've had this experience a lot where I encounter a new artwork and my initial reaction, if I don't have the context for it, is like, oh, what the fuck is that, And you have to, like, the beauty reveals itself later, where the initial aesthetic impression of something is just chaos or noise or something that's frightening to me or against my person, but I don't have the tools I need to engage with it more deeply. And then I revisit the piece later and the like strategies for engagement have gotten a bit better. And then the beauty starts to emerge that I wasn't able to see before. Yeah, I guess my worry would be how consistently we can like place beauty as a thing outside that's like solid in its own right, rather than maybe like one step in kind of a string of cognitive processes that might be kind of circling around as we're kind of encountering the world and assimilating new things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's maybe slightly different versions of beauty there at play. Like, I think maybe there's a cognitive beauty of like what one finds beautiful. Maybe there's a sexual version of it as well, sexual selection version, which is very domain specific. But I really suspect that there is this sort of universal aspect or quality of beauty, which is maybe its own thing, that that is just out there. It's just like, it's like the perception of when music is out of tune or not. Somehow all of the elements of nature and the universe and stars and light and, you know, dark matter and all of that stuff, it just arranges itself in such a aesthetic manner. And yeah, and maybe you're right that, you know, one can never prove that in any way. But I think for me it's very obvious.
I feel like there's also an element of, and I think this goes across kind of both of these conceptions that we're talking about, some level of like communication and legibility. Like things become more beautiful when they're legible to us and meaningful, and we can understand why the pieces are put together in that way.
I would disagree.
Yeah?
Yeah.
What would...
I don't think you need legibility. I don't think you need to understand anything to appreciate its beauty. I think even, you know, even as a kid, you can go out into nature and not know anything about nature and still find it extremely beautiful, you know. And I think animals think nature is beautiful too. Have you ever seen those videos of like candid moments of like a bear or something like staring at the sunset? Yeah. I think that's true. I think, yeah, I mean, and that's why I don't think it's like so subject bound, you know, to humans. I think like animals can also, they also appreciate this like divine splendor that just exists, and we have such a hard time proving it because we have no way, we don't know how to even do that, you know. We have no way of classifying that. But I think it's a mistake to think that it's not true and it's not there. And yeah, I mean, the alternative is to think that there's no such thing as true beauty, that it's all just like dead. It's all just a figment of our imagination, which I think is like the logical dead end of Western consciousness. It goes hand in hand. Like, to think that there's no provable beauty out there is, it's the flip side of just believing there's nothing provable at all outside of one's own consciousness, like the fundamental Kantian idealism or correlationism. That's the logical end of that. And from that point of view, yeah, like it's all just random and meaningless. But I reject that. Yeah. And I think it's so obvious that it's impossible to prove.
I'm trying to remember. There were 2 points I wanted to interject on. Like whether when I have that little moment of beauty that, say, some piece of music, like there's this composer, Ioannis Xenakis, who, when you hear the stuff for the first time, you're like, oh my God, this is screeching, terrible din, basically. Like most people react really viscerally negatively to it. And there was a really great concert last year for the centennial of his birthday, where some of the music was played live in context with more recent musicians who were also playing with noise and atonal music. And then when I was there in the space, the music clicked in a different way. Mm-hmm. And this kind of, but I'm not sure if it would have clicked if I hadn't also tried to read through some of his writing too and understand that this thing that I perceived as like noise at first was him trying to map out structure. Basically, early on in the computer revolution, he was trying to kind of create these computerized sounds where the note could come from anywhere in the possibility space of notes. And somehow the trying to understand the words let me have viscerally immediately experience a thing that before I would have covered my ears as a beautiful thing. Mm-hmm. And whether maybe it's possible for this true beauty, this kind of ideal beauty that sits outside any one of us, could simultaneously be all those little moments of beauty and discovery that happen within each of our lives, or in the life of a bear as it's sitting and looking at the sun hitting a river, or whatever it is. Like, I don't know if that there's a binary line that needs to be drawn there.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think it's, just like, appreciation for culturally specific instances of beauty or taste or something like, I think, there's plenty of examples where to really appreciate some aspect of some specific culture or like a dish or something, you kind of have to have some knowledge about it to appreciate it. Or like adult foods, you have to, like when I was a kid, I really hated capers and cheese, and now I really love cheese and capers. And there's plenty of things like that where you just need to like acquire a taste for it. But I don't think that disqualifies just this general universal beauty. It's hard to say how it's related. Maybe it's like the universal beauty like flows into the other eddies and streams.
This brings to mind a quote that I think I saved from the Cone book. Would it be cool if I drop that in and maybe we see if it pulls in? Otherwise, we can cut this.
Yeah, of course.
Cool. In this specific chapter, he's talking about how the Runa, this community of people living in the Amazon within Ecuador, conceptualize death and relate it back to their thoughts on the spirit world, which Cone argues is basically the same as the virtual, as you would argue like from a Deleuzian perspective. So here's the quote. The always already realm of the forest masters captures something of the quality of being inside form. According to people in Avila, the dead, when they go ukuta, or inside the spirit realm of the masters, become free. Huanu guanca lugar, they say, the dead are free. Lugar, which I'm glossing as freedom, is derived from the Spanish lugar, whose primary meaning is place. But lugar also has a temporal referent. The phrase tener lugar, although today infrequently used in Ecuadorian Spanish, means to have the time or opportunity to do something. In Quechua, lugar refers to a domain where worldly spatio-temporal constraints are relaxed. It is a sort of realm where cause and effect no longer directly applies. To become lugar, as people in Avila explain, is to become free from earthly toil and suffering, free from God's judgment and punishment, and free from the effects of time. Inside this perpetual, always already realm of the masters in the forest, the dead just carry on, free. Humans do not impose form on the tropical forest. The forest proliferates it. One can think of coevolution as a reciprocal proliferation of regularities or habits among interacting species. The tropical forest amplifies form in myriad directions thanks to the ways in which its many kinds of selves interrelate. Over evolutionary time, organisms come to represent, with increasing specificity, environments made ever more complex through the ways in which other organisms come to more exhaustively represent their surroundings. In neotropical forests, this proliferation of habits has occurred to a degree unmatched by any other non-human system on this planet. Any attempt at harnessing the living beings of the forest is wholly dependent on the ways in which beings are embedded in these regularities. I gotta bring it home now. And also a bit weird to just kind of drop death in when we're talking about beauty. Maybe I should step back. We were talking about beauty and where like the beautiful might exist outside of our individual experiences of it. And yeah, it brought to mind this notion that Cohen is transcribing from his interactions with the people in Avila, of a kind of world without cause and effect that kind of exists beyond our day-to-day experience, which you could call the spirit world, you could call the virtual, in the sense that a writer like Deleuze would probably talk about it. Yeah, does beauty live there? And
yeah, I mean, Delanda thinks that the spirit world lives on the plane of immanence, the plane of possibility, which is the realm of the virtual, and
for listeners, this is the philosopher Manuel Delanda.
Yeah. And God is the pure plane of immanence, the pure virtuality, the space of pure possibility, of endless possibility. And then, but we exist on the actual plane, surrounded by virtuality, and there's a kind of a gradient between the actuality and the virtuality. And then the spirits live somewhere in between. And Delanda gets, quite specific about this, but I don't think he's written about it actually yet.
Yeah, you know him pretty well and you've had some it sounds like great conversations with him over the years, right?
Yeah, I've been fortunate to get to know him a bit in New York over the last years, but now he's moved back to Mexico. Yeah.
Reason to visit Mexico.
But why did you, let's put it this way, why did you write that down? Like, what is it about that quote that interested you?
I think over the past few years, it's strange because art is all about kind of living in this virtual world, where you, like in the most rudimentary example of a painting, You have an experience over a few days, weeks, months, whatever, putting pigment, smearing it around on a little piece of canvas or plywood, and then it's able to generate this image and keep doing that even when you're not there. And so we're, as artists, people who are making these objects that are trying to communicate, even when we're not around, we're always engaged with the virtual, but I feel like maybe it was just a weird string of gaps in my education where I didn't feel like I had good tools to talk about like what that thing was. Like in grad critiques, it would always, people would kind of get shy around where it starts to veer into potentially like woo-woo territory. They're like, oh no, let's just talk about what that specific color is doing next to that specific color and keep it grounded in the mechanics of image production in that specific case. But yeah, so I guess it's been a kind of running question of when we think about virtual, like you say the word virtual now and people think of things that happen on computers, or maybe if they have an educational background for it, they think about things that happen in cinema or in images more broadly. But like, what is that thing? And what are the mechanics that govern it? And how does it connect to us sitting here in the here and now? Right. With a table I can feel, like I hear the vibrations of my own voice.
Yeah, I mean, in this philosophical sense, the virtual is, of course, not the cyber virtual, but the possible, you know?
Yeah.
It's like all the possibilities that are surrounding all objects and materials and what they're capable of and all the things that could happen in reality. That's what the virtual is. And that space, in a sense, is also constrained in specific ways. But of course, it gets more constrained as it actualizes. And so there's this gradient from actual to pure virtual.
What techniques have you found, I guess in your own experience, how far up that gradient have you personally felt like you've gone? Like, I imagine drugs might be involved with any stories you feel like telling, but yeah, have you ever experienced something that felt more purely virtual?
Yeah, I think that's what psychedelic experiences give you access to in some way. It lets you tap into the space of possibilities and navigate it a bit more clearly. But, it's still such a mystery. I don't know if I can actually say much about it. Yeah.
Yeah, like you mentioned, like kind of this commonplace virtual we think about of like, oh, stuff that happens on a computer screen. I mean, that's also super present in your work. Like most of your working day, like I've come to hang out in the studio and you'll just spend 8 hours like staring at a workstation, like, okay, let me add another line of code here. Let me change some parameters here. And it's all mediated back to you looking at this screen.
Right.
Does that work start to feel alienating for you? Does it feel empowering? Some other emotion that none of the above, all of the above?
I think it just feels natural, maybe. Even though it's not what most people associate with natural, but just, what I grew up with. So it's the easiest for me to use. And I think I leave it there, basically. I think, like, for me, I think that oftentimes there's a lot read into the medium, that using that kind of digital media, like, has some sort of specific statement to it. But I think from the experience of being an artist, kind of just fall into the tools that you use, based on just the contingencies of your life. And for me, that happened to be getting into computers, and so it was never really a decision in that sense, and ultimately, I don't even believe in an ontological distinction of technology. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Like, I don't think that category exists ultimately.
Mm.
Or if it does, it's all just like the extended phenotype of us,
Mm.
and in the way that a seashell is the extended phenotype of a mollusk. But also it gets even more complicated, like other beings are technologies too, right? Like horses are technologies, but we didn't synthesize them necessarily. Or even further back, you can think of I would think of like a eukaryotic cell, like mitochondria as a kind of technology. Like today, mitochondria is like our ATP cell power energy system, but it started off just as like a parasitic species.
Makes me think of this meme, like in biology class, it was always, the mitochondria is the factory of the cell.
Oh, yeah. Right, exactly. Yeah, so what is that a technology? I think you can make the case for it. But yeah, I think ultimately just focusing on this category on technology is kind of fruitless, I think.
Hmm.
Yeah. And that's, I think, one of the reasons that I never really I was so into like the dominant post-internet discourse on technology, because I don't believe in technology.
Yeah. Another meme comes to mind where it's the clip from The Simpsons, and Bart Simpson is sitting in class, and they all say, say the line again, Bart.
Yeah.
He says, my work exists at the intersection of art and technology.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, it does seem like we have such a muddled way of talking about technology. But then at the same time, so much of our conversation, we kind of take the technologies that we're familiar with and then we project them back onto older things, like, the mitochondria becomes analogous to a factory. And, or this organism working in this way becomes analogous to a computer.
Right.
And it's, I don't know, tempting to say, maybe we're just projecting our humanness onto everything, and this is totally just a misperception on our part, because how can a cell be a computer? But then at the same time, maybe there is a kind of formal similarity that is real, even if our language around it is clumsy. Like in terms of if the cell is a rudimentary, basic little agent that's trying to achieve, maybe it's just the simple goal of eating some sugar and reproducing itself. Then there are, if you were going to draw out a diagram of how that cell interacts with its environment and what it will tend to want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then you map that out with how a computer is designed. There are meaningful formal similarities at that level.
Mm-hmm.
And the metaphor isn't just entirely obfuscating something.
Mm. Right.
Sometimes I leave the awkward silences in for dramatic effect.
Yeah, I don't know what to say to that. I guess I feel like, I don't know, it's so tricky. Language is so tricky, right? Because on one scale, we need to have something that identifies whatever we're interacting with. like technology or whatever. But then at another scale, maybe at an ontological scale, it's not really, it breaks down and you can't really pinpoint it, and there's no clear definition. And yeah, I kind of think there's a similar thing that happens with like the concept of nature. And, you know, there was this moment a few years ago when like everybody was like proclaiming like the end of nature, or you know what I mean? Like that there was
like this Anthropocene moment.
Yeah, but like in this kind of philosophical way that like they rejected the romanticist essentialism of nature, and so their conclusion was like a wholesale rejection of the term of natural, and that everything was synthetic. And I mean, I guess there's that Timothy Morton book, After Nature. Is that what it's called? I forgot. But I think that's kind of, that's like really, again, like the Western path, you know, like that's the logical path of the Western consciousness. And from an indigenous point of view, like to question whether or not nature exists is preposterous, because it's obviously it exists. And it exists in a way that the Western consciousness is not easily able to even grasp, which is this living spiritual way that's very difficult, I think, for Western point of view to integrate. But yeah, I think that's a very interesting territory for me, is like identifying that in particular, that like the spirituality of nature and how difficult it is to approach it from a Western point of view.
In a lot of your work, you'll build up these increasingly complicated simulations to try and recreate the image of a beautiful environment that you might have seen and taken photos of or 3D scans of while traveling. Mm-hmm. For you, is the experience of looking at that rendering and looking at that nature as it was in the moment you were out there, is there a fundamental similarity there, or is there a line that you draw between those things?
Yeah, I mean, of course it's inspired by it, and you try to get as close to it as you can, close to that feeling. Yeah.
It's a question I always have encountering your work, and maybe it's interesting to bring in, like, a lot of people who I've spoken to about your work get this initial read that there's somehow like some cynicism hidden in there somewhere. Mm-hmm. Right. And I wonder if it comes from, I guess, a kind of common belief that like the poster of nature that's saying, oh, visit Montana, is somehow fundamentally distinct and separate from being there and like being in it and standing. And
yeah. There's this really funny thing that happens, which is like people describe like my rendered landscapes as idealized landscapes that don't exist in real life. But it's actually like my renderings, like they only come up to a fraction of how beautiful real places are and the real places that I'm trying to model. I think this just reflects how most people just like don't spend enough time in nature, and they don't have a lot of experience in nature. You know, they've only been to like Wannsee or something, you know, like there's not, especially in Europe and in Germany, like there's such a dearth of like grandiose landscape and untouched wilderness. And it's a really unique thing. And, you know, especially places that you have to walk at least an hour to, you know, from a car, like those are very unique places that most people don't experience. But they exist, and they're 100 times more beautiful than any image that I can, 100 million times more beautiful than any image that I could ever produce. And so I think it just just exemplifies how people just don't even believe in places can be that beautiful. And if they are, then it's like somehow a cynical ploy or advertisement or something, you know.
This German philosopher who's pretty well known in Germany, but not so well known outside of Germany, Thomas Metzinger, has kind of a core thesis that runs through a lot of his work that and he's not the first to say this, but probably the most elegant description of it I've come across, that in a sense, neuroscience tells us that we're always already living in virtual reality. Mm-hmm. And like meaning more specifically, our personal experience of self, of mind, is this emergent process that's generated by the functions of the brain. So what we perceive as immediately real always kind of gets filtered through the mechanics of our body's sensing apparatus and how it relays that back to its brain. And the brain kind of builds out this subliminal model of the world that we live in, mm-hmm. where most of, like, I don't need to constantly think about I'm in a room with four walls with this kind of acoustics. It just kind of gets established as the baseline, mm-hmm. but I have to perceive it first and then render out this kind of subliminal model of where my body is, what the space is like, mm-hmm. how those two things are interrelating.
Right.
And yeah, I wonder if on that level we could go back to the distinction between the being in the nature and the image of being in nature, of like a simulated nature viewed through a computer screen. Mm. There's always the question of if that simulation could have enough rendering power, would at some point, even if we're consciously able to distinguish it as a distinct thing, on a more subliminal level, our brain kind of receives it as reality. At least the way we experience dreams is real.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. But do you have a question related to that, or?
Just wanted to bring it in to circle around, because you've also done work with VR. Mm-hmm. And yeah, there's kind of that paradox that runs through your work that it's like you're constantly putting the VR glasses on our heads as an artist, but then we put the glasses on and you're telling us to go touch grass. And it's...
Yeah, I mean... when it comes to the digital simulations of nature that I make, for me a long time ago, it stopped being about trying to make a perfect copy of nature, or God forbid, like trying to replace nature. But for me, it really turned into like a devotional sort of, almost like a vipassana meditative practice, where you're kind of forced to just like look deeper and deeper and deeper at what you see and what you perceive. And then the CG process is like a way of enacting that observation. And for me, that's like it's an amazing practice, it's so interesting to me to like to be forced to look deeper and deeper and deeper, and just encounter so much counterintuitive beauty that you find in nature, like things that you wouldn't think that they are that way from a distance or some, but then once you get closer, you realize that they're like, counterintuitively beautiful. Um, I think that this also relates to like the experience of growing up in a desert, especially southern Arizona, like the Sonoran Desert, which is a very unique desert. But dominant global culture is a temperate forest culture, right? Or a temperate culture, and it has less experience with deserts, and so in the media, growing up, I remember like deserts are always depicted as these like dead, brown, lifeless places. But then if you're in a real desert and you examine any square centimeter of the ground or of a cactus or something, like you find incredible structure and detail and color and, iridescent colors um, and just like a deep living quality, counterintuitive, alien living quality, um, in a way that wasn't ever reflected in the broader consciousness. And the same goes for cultures, like having grown up in this Native American culture. Native Americans were depicted in this very flat, boring, uninteresting way that said nothing about them. It was always in relation to whatever white narrative characters or whatever.
Yeah, whichever cowboy just rolled into town.
Yeah, exactly. So boring. Talk about boring. But the real culture is like also just alien and gorgeous and counterintuitive and in ways that just people have no idea about. And it's sad. So with my virtual renderings, it's just really my way of like paying homage to the landscapes that I see. And I mean, maybe, I could do it with photography, for example. But even with photography, it doesn't force you to really look at every little thing and think about how to simulate it, It doesn't force you to simulate it because you have direct access to just depicting it. And then you could also paint it, and maybe painting forces you to look closer if you're doing like realistic painting. But I think that there's also something really interesting about not only depicting its two-dimensional representation, but also, the mechanics and attractors that build up that space. And I think that that's where the computer comes in an interesting way, where you can kind of simulate those processes, and I'm always excited when there's new tools that are more natural, offer more natural approaches to simulating those things. And now with AI, I think there's going to be a lot of really cool tools that will be able to do that.
Jamie gave me the idea that I need recurring questions. Like, have you ever seen these Lex Friedman podcasts where at the end he's like, "What is love?" And he fucking hits everyone with this.
Oh yeah.
But we ended up with two that I kind of liked. The first question is, what's something you've learned in your work as an artist that you think a non-artist should know?
maybe something about the beauty of contingency. Maybe this also goes back to the original thing that we were talking about like a universal beauty, is that there's something beautiful in contingency, in the way, the way the chips fall, the way the cookie crumbles, the happy accident, there's something about that in art. To make a really good piece, I always find, like, if you have some element that just, you let it express itself, that's where you're going to get something really interesting and beautiful, even if it's not something that you can completely control or predict. And I think that that's like a good lesson to have as an artist, and maybe that also applies to non-artists in some way. I wouldn't know.
So to keep an eye out for contingency around you.
Yeah, or just make space for contingency.
The second question is, what advice would you give to a young person who might be listening to this, maybe now, maybe in years from now, and they listen and they say, oh, that's cool, I want to do something like what he does? What would you say to them?
You mean like become an artist?
Yeah. Or the founder of a new religion? Either or. Maybe there's not much difference between those two things at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, I wouldn't go so far as to call myself. This is a very interesting thing to think about, because it's like, I think that this is actually like a real, like, genuine political impulse that I have. Like, I think that this is actually, like, maybe what's necessary to address something like climate change, to tap into this, like, deep behavior system of spirituality and religion. But on the other hand, like, it's like tied up so much with, like, moral purity and things like that, like, I think as an artist you can just never, you can't attain that, or that's, like, not really, that's a different world in a way. But I think that it's kind of, it's necessary. So it's an interesting kind of dynamic to, like, how do you talk about these things that's not necessarily tied to this overbearing, maybe more Western traditional notion of moral purity and things like that, which is not to say that I think that morality isn't a part of it, or ethics isn't a part of it, which I think it is, but but I think being an artist is a good position, and I wouldn't claim to be anything more than an artist. And it allows you to kind of, use everything as a material and kind of dabble in anything and dip in and out of anything.
How would you speak to that young person then who listens to this and says, oh, I want to be an artist like that? What advice would you give them, if anything?
Don't become too much of an art fan. I think, like, if you really, like, idolize historical art, then you end up just, like, repeating it and, like, not necessarily pushing it. And I think, and maybe this is then a path that's more suited to curators or historians, but I think to be an artist, like, don't get too enamored with the art that's out there. Don't even necessarily get too enamored with your own art, but just, just keep making